So today's date is June 10th, 2015. I'm here at the Estes Park Museum with Eric Rose, and we're here today to talk about the 2013 floods that occurred in September of that year. So really quick, Eric, if you mind telling us your name and occupation?
Yeah, I am Eric Rose. I am a commander with the police department in charge of patrol operations, and I have an ancillary duty of emergency manager when needed.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to dive right in. What do you remember about the week before the flooding began?
This is the time of year when we get prepared for the Scott Fest, and in patrol operations we plan the Scott Fest pretty early on because it's such a large event. And I remember that week that as they were putting the tents up on the fairgrounds, that a pretty large rainstorm came through. Not too untypical for that time of year, but what I do remember is that it was long and the heavy rainfall was so much that it actually washed out partial areas of the roadway in the fairgrounds that the vendors use for setting up. So it delayed Scott Fest a bit as far as the setup time. And then the next couple of days after that, it was nice and sunny. So it was kind of one of those, hey, we've got rain, but now we're ready for the visitors to show up. And when they had a Scott Fest, and it was over, and the Sunday afternoon at the Scott Fest, it started raining again. And that evening, it didn't stop. It just kept raining and raining. And that's why I do remember. It's just that it was, because we've had rain at Scott Fest before, but that particular part where it washed out some areas of the roadway was just significant now that I look back.
What are some things or initial steps you would take when you see roads starting to wash out initially?
Well, we have plans in place as far as the emergency management side of operations for the town of Estes Park. I work with the streets department, work with public works, and specifically in areas of getting sandbags ready or street closure materials in case we need to close a street down if it floods. Typically in the past, and we're in runoff season now, and we're experiencing some waters coming through that are a little bit faster velocity than we typically see in years past, which I would attribute to the flood, by the way. But we have set up signage and such because in the Confluence Park area, Riverside Plaza, where the two rivers come together, sometimes that water will get to the point where it comes over the bridge and then it'll cover that roadway. And so we have material set up just in case we need to close that down to keep people from driving over that. It's more as an inconvenience. We don't think it's a danger as much unless it got truly a flood stage, but at this point, typically it's just an annoyance.
Awesome. And then when did you first realize something catastrophic was happening?
I got a call from dispatch fairly early in the morning, and forgive me if I can't tell you the date because there are some blurry spots in this entire process. But it was early in the morning after the Scott Fest, so they said that there was some flooding occurring. And so I actually drove into dispatch it was around midnight or so. And we were just watching the waters because the rain had not quit. It was just unusual. Typically, Estes Park rain will come through the evenings or in the afternoons, and then it goes away. It's just that the cloud cover works over the mountains, and it's pretty normal. But the rain didn't stop, and it just kept raining. And so when dispatch called me and said, we've got some flooding in the areas of Fish Creek, which was unusual, because Fish Creek is typically at that time was a very small creek. And it was more water than we'd seen in my career, and I've been here 20 years now. And so we plan ahead. So we got there to start talking about evacuations and what we would do if the water was rising into people's houses.
What do you do if you do have to plan evacuations?
We have what's called, in the old days, it was called Reverse 911. Mm-hmm. Now it's called an Everbridge system, which is just a company name. But we use the Reverse 911 system to activate many devices now. We can call the landline, people can sign up for emails, if they have pagers, smartphones, those types of things, they can get texting. So we have an array of technology now that we use to notify people of any types of incidents like that.
And at what point during the event did you guys activate that reverse 911?
It was pretty early in the morning, and it started out that we were watching Fish Creek, and then we realized that the canyon area, which is outside of our town limits, but we're still responsible for it through the fire district to dispatch for, started seeing some rise in the canyon levels. And so we started putting some evacuation notices out before daylight.
Awesome. And I think I already asked this. What were some of your first thoughts when you realized what was going on?
Well, I typically go to resource management. That's where I've been trained. I was thinking of personnel call-outs, how many people we're going to need, certainly dive team folks, fire department folks, search and rescue types, and where we were going to deploy, where we could start calling people in and just getting people ready and mounted up just in case this thing started to go for the evacuation stages. And we were doing some pre-notices first, just to let people know that the water's starting to rise. Just be careful, you know. In the pre-notices, it would instruct them to, if you do see any flooding that we need to know about, that could send our search and rescue folks to that area, or our fire department folks, or officers, just to monitor. So we got some pre-notices out first, and then once we started getting callbacks that yes, the water is rising around residences, and some areas actually going inside of residences in the canyon and out in the Fish Creek area, is when we started to send folks.
And did you have to activate any mutual aid agreements or reach out farther than
You know,
your
all those are
network?
in place prior.
Mm-hmm.
Each year we'll update those, and typically they'll last a couple, 3 years. And we just go around and make sure all our mutual aids and mutual forms of agreements are out there ready to go, governmental agreements. And typically in the emergency services industry, especially here in Estes Park, I mean, we work very well together as far as assistance and aiding folks. I can say you right now, if a document wasn't in place, they'd still help. Mm-hmm. But they're there. We have agreements with fire department, EMS, Rocky Mountain National Park, Larimer County, all those.
Great. And what were some of your responsibilities during the flood?
As the emergency manager, it was overall management of the incident itself. So opening an EOC, Emergency Operations Center, notifying personnel that needed to be involved, and then incident management team was put together, and that was typically the department heads of the town. So my job was to manage that incident management team in the operations of whichever direction this incident led. So whether it's street closures, sandbagging, rescue operations, notifications, just all those areas of the emergency management for life safety. And life safety is first, property second.
Absolutely. What were some of the challenges that you encountered as you were managing the EOC and incident command and those things that go on with that?
Personnel allocation is difficult. We do a lot with less in Estes Park. We have, we've got some great well-trained people, but sometimes when you start shifting all those folks out in the field, you kind of end up with, nothing left in the EOC to work with because but they needed to be. I mean, they needed to be out there, working with their folks to make sure things were taken care of, plus pitching in. I mean, we have supervisors that actually work in the field, and it's not as larger cities might have more resources than we do. So that was some of the things I saw, but it went well. I mean, one of the things that was amazing to me was how quickly volunteers started calling in. Volunteers were everywhere, and you could utilize those folks. They were really willing to help the ones that were in need.
That's great. How did you prioritize what needed to be done?
Once we realized that the waters were rising in a point that we'd never really seen before, I was mapping areas on boards in the EOC and determining which areas that needed attention the most. And so we put scouts out, observers, with radio to give us ideas on the water rise. And then we would draw maps and locate those areas that needed to have the attention first. So that was a priority to make sure that we were in the right areas at the right time. Plus trying to anticipate where low points in the rivers were. So we anticipated those low points, we put some people in those areas as well. And then some more of those alerts went out too, from the Everbridge system, the reverse 911, to give us indicators, for folks to call in, as well as to warn them that the rising water was coming their way.
Did you guys use a lot of technology to map those out? I've heard other people say GIS played a big factor in being able to do that.
GIS was a great factor. A very good advantage for us. I mean, we had I asked pretty early on to get some large maps printed up, and we did, and then we pushed them out the EOC and then utilized those for planning.
Great. And did you develop any kind of daily routine during the event, both on and off the clock?
Excuse me. Yes, and there wasn't much off the clock, to be quite honest with you. I was up pretty early each morning because I get up and get updates on all the graphs that I would use online for hydraulic predictions, rain predictions, weather predictions in the first couple of days for sure. And I set up briefing with the incident management team at 0700, so we would all come together and then plan the day's activities. We typically, the way emergency operations works within the ICS model, which is Incident Command System, which is pretty much nationwide now. You plan your daily operations in chunks of goals, of very short and sweet goals that you put together, always working towards the long-term goal of the recovery point. But in the response portion that we were in, we would come together with a plan of a daily ops of something along the lines of 2 or 3 or 4 major tasks to be accomplished that day. And things like shoring up the bridges on Fish Creek and observers out on all the sewage lines or water lines to see how we could protect those if we could. And some we couldn't actually protect, they just got damaged. But those types of daily goals, as well as safety ops or operations, I shouldn't shorten everything. So safety operations for the personnel on scenes and making sure everybody was rested, ready to go with their plans in place.
About how many people did you guys end up having to evacuate during the flood?
This is an approximate, of course, and obviously I'm reaching for that thought. I just remember at the evacuation centers, there was at least 300 to 500 people that were there for showing up. For some reason or another, they might not have been totally evacuated, but they certainly were coming for supplies and for information and those types of things. I remember during one of the meetings, I was talking to a citizen that I didn't know. She was a visitor, but all of us kind of got stuck up here because we were an outpost at that point with all of our roads that were shut down, which was incredible. And I got another story I can tell you about that. But anyway, I'm talking to the citizen, and she said, why do you think this happened? And I just answered her with kind of an offhand, well, we didn't cause this, but we're going to fix this, ma'am. And that kind of came a catchphrase. And every time I went to a meeting, people would I'd say that. It just started coming out. So it's one of our catchphrases in the morning at briefings, and then we went and talked to folks out in the field. And it kind of got where people were saying it back to us. We'll fix it. We know we're going to fix it. But back to, if I'm answering the question correctly, back to who would have imagined that all the roads into Estes Park were shut down? That was never a scenario possibility. I attended a FEMA training center in Emmitsburg, Maryland a few years prior to this. And we had a flood scenario. And it was the big Thompson Canyon flood into Loveland area with a little bit of effect on Estes Park. No one ever considered that all the roads would be shut down. That was the challenge, the huge challenge. I remember the first afternoon, or second afternoon, calling up Safeway, trying to work out how we could get their trucks to come in to bring groceries because the groceries were disappearing quite quickly off the shelves. When we finally opened up Trail Ridge, this was the first time the park had ever allowed a truck of this size. We had to get special permissions to get groceries over Trail Ridge, diapers, and formula, all those things, essentials that we needed to have that people were running out of. It just, I'm saying that because the magnitude is something we just never anticipated, but we certainly adapted.
Fantastic. About what are some of those other challenges of being isolated as a community with all the roads being washed out?
Providing community security and comfort. I think when people realized that they couldn't move out of this location, some panic started to arise. And being able to spread the news that yes, we're going to have Safeway's trucks coming in. Yes, we have some National Guard helicopters dropping supplies down in Glen Haven and up in Estes Park. Those remedies, I think, helped, but there was a panic of sorts coming over the community because of the fact that we were closed in and couldn't go anywhere.
How long would you say that lasted?
I think our first opening, and it was only emergency traffic, was about 3 or 4 days after the initial event, somewhere in that area. And so it was still a very rough road to travel because all the roads had been washed out. So CDOT was helping, National Guard was helping to come up 36, CDOT was coming up 34 to try to get us some temporary roads going out. And 34 was so devastated, it took much longer to get that open than it did 36. And 36 still had some I've been on from four-wheel drive roads before. It was amazing how damaged those roads were, even though they were partially repaired. So about 3 or 4 days, I believe it was.
Thank you. And I imagine this was a pretty stressful time for you. How did that stress manifest for you?
You know, I really didn't think about it until you approached me for this interview. And I know that one of the things that I gained, the positivity side of it, I guess would be, was when I would go to the community meetings and see the teamwork of the citizens, as well as all the employees from the town of Estes Park come together. That really helped out stress-wise for me. I think now that I look back, just knowing how overwhelming, how I think I mentioned earlier, volunteers were just coming out of the woodwork to help with everyone, and that was a positive encouragement for me. So I think that was a stress reliever now that I look back at it. Because I really enjoyed going to the meetings and reporting our progress. And we always had progress. We had plans in place. I mean, we had a plan to actually build a wall out of steel to slow down some of the flow on Fish Creek into Lake Estes. And it would have worked. We just, getting materials was going to be a difficult thing. But we had those in place, and then the water started to subside, so we didn't have to do that, which would have been a major expense. A cofferdam is what it's called. But so just to give you an idea, we really had some good people working in the right places at the right time for this event to come together. To reiterate on that, when I went to that flood training for FEMA, that emergency incident training, Frank Lancaster was a county manager at that time. He was at that training with me. That's the first time I met Frank Lancaster. And who would have known, 2 years later, we'd be together actually working in that scenario.
How did that relationship work? Because I know when the incident happens, you become the head chain of command. So can you talk about that relationship between...
Well, it's not totally the head chain of command. I'm in charge of the incident management team for the emergency management, but I still report to the town administrator for guidance, of course. But my role then changed to being the emergency incident coordinator. So with the training that I have and the experience that I've gained over the years, then my role then works in coordination with Mr. Lancaster in that area.
Fantastic. And then you mentioned the community meetings a little bit. What was the environment like?
Well, initially it was fear and some panic. And we had good volunteers, good folks coming from Red Cross that were helping out, that were in the area, that were already here, to help out some of those folks with anxiety. Our medical community stepped up and helped out for folks that needed some, and counselors came in for some of those. But once we started laying out, what we knew, what we didn't know, and then how we had plans to take care of both of those, and the contingencies, it started to ease that fear and anxiety. and they got more of it was almost like a team cheering environment atmosphere for the football or the baseball team that's on the, winning the game. It was one of those types of atmospheres. It was encouraging.
That's great. Was there a low point for you during the event?
Yes. It was, in some of those meetings, I'd get some one-on-one time, very little bit because it was quite busy, but I'd hear some stories of people's and of their losses, and that was pretty low. Because you do your best to, try to protect your community, and still things can occur, and just losses in property, losses of pets, those important things in life that we have. Yeah, that was difficult.
And then the counterpoint to that, was there a moment during all of this that provided some positivity for you? I know you mentioned the community meetings.
Yeah, one of the community meetings, one of the folks stood up and said they were in Katrina, and they said they wanted to thank us for how well we were managing this event, as opposed to how they had experienced the Katrina storm, and that we were well prepared. It was obvious that we're going to be in good hands, and the crowd cheered and clapped and applause.
Awesome. And then going along with that, how did your team work to protect more vulnerable populations in the town?
Excuse me again. We, in the ICS system, there's branches. You've got, your operations level, your logistics level, which is getting resources and things like that, your medical and your police side for security, those types of things. One of the things I asked my operations commander for the police department and the medical department was to work with dispatch. And we know through data who in the area has, they say, shut-ins and or oxygen-dependent folks and things like that. We'd identified those very quickly and went out and did some house-to-house checks on those folks to make sure that things were working. That we even had a fire department help with putting some generators where power loss was at, because the O2 systems don't work without some power. So we worked on those areas. I think they did a great job identifying where those special needs folks were and how we could get out and do some assistance and help for them.
Great. And then I'm going to jump back a little bit. Earlier you said, you're focused primarily on Estes Park, but you do respond out into the canyons. How did you guys respond to the flood as it was happening, maybe down towards Drake or Lyons? And
the fire department had water rescues over the river. We were dispatching for that. Volunteers went down and helped with that. We even had officers go. We knew when the roads were damaged and we were shut in that this whole area was now going to be our responsibility. So there really wasn't a line anymore from the town of Estes Park to the Estes Valley. The communication that we did have, we had a communication breakdown too, but the communication we had during the initial response phase to the county was that, we talked back and forth and explained to them, yes, we will assist you in all that we're doing. A deputy actually got trapped down in Big Elk Meadows and was down there clearing houses out and asking for evacuations when the bridge failed. He was there for 4 days or so, or 5 days, could not get out. So there was a resource tied up, he was doing a great job helping out those 5 families down there, but we couldn't get to him. So we took the role of the Larimer County Deputy's Sheriff's Office to help out and assist the areas that were outlying of Estes Park. And then we had a major power outage that hit because of some of the flooding waters, and we lost communications for quite some time, which was cell phone communications, emergency radio communications, just about internet, just about everything. It was amazing. We do have some backup systems that we use that are very short range that we could use, but our major communications links were all had failed at one time. And since then we've actually put in more technology so that won't happen again. You learn.
Absolutely. What are some of the things you do when there's that lack of communication, when you're cut off like that?
That's why the daily briefings were so important. Mm-hmm. Everybody knew where to report, when to report, and what they're expected expectations were for the day.
Great.
Yeah, and then we'd have check-ins throughout the day, and then you'd do some monitoring. I could go out in the field a bit and just check the different areas and make sure that everybody had what they needed resource-wise. Our engineer at that time, Scott Zern, came up with an idea of, we had such issues getting road base. Everybody was becoming overwhelmed in the county. It wasn't just Estes Park. So we'd call in for the state or the Larimer County for resources, and they didn't have any left. And so we needed road base. We needed road base badly for areas here, as well as to repair down 34 and 36 from our end, because it was a joint effort coming from the valley up and from us down, to fill in those holes, because everything had been washed away. Well, we had all this rock come down through the rivers into Lake Estes. So we got permission, working with Bureau of Reclamation, to salvage that rock and crush it and use it for a road base, which was brilliant. To the point where we actually supplied road base for other areas throughout the county, because we had so much of that rock that we could crush up.
That's great. And I know you talked a little bit about communication internally. What about communication out to the public? How did that work?
I think we did a really good job at that, and we learned as we went through this process. But one of the things that was just an idea that popped up in one of our daily briefings was there's going to be folks that are not going to be able to make our meetings, not be able to get to the town hall for the meetings. So we set up email addresses and call-ins. And so even folks that were out of state that were worried about their properties could call in our email, and we would answer those questions live during the meetings. And we broadcasted those meetings as well. And one of the things when we had that communications breakdown was, we need some other type of public address system. Since then, we built an AM radio station to handle that need now. So if we would have had that back then, we could have used that AM radio station to broadcast out to folks that couldn't get to the town hall as well. And AM radio is very well. I mean, you can go to a car, just about everybody can get to an AM radio somewhere. Well, we have that now, but we learned again.
That's great. Were you personally affected by the flood?
I grew a lot. Learned a lot of experience. We were recently grandparents, my wife and I, and we were daycare for kiddos, and we have a special needs grandchild, and the flood hit, and the parents couldn't make it up. So let me think about this. We had the kids for at least 2 weeks. So I might have mistaken my first quote, or my first answer. We were locked out for quite some time now that I think about it, because she has special formula needs that we couldn't get up here. And we were able to drive down to make a relay in Lyons, as they live in Loveland, had to drive around to Lyons to get formula for her. And it was about 2.5 weeks or so after the incident. So we had our grandkids for quite some time, actually. And there was personally affected us all because the parents wanted to get their kiddos back, but we were locked in up here. So my wife did a great job taking care of kiddos and running the household while just told me to go and take care of this. She was a great support.
Then, how did you balance, your professional and your personal responsibilities at that time?
My wife balanced that for me. All my personal responsibilities she took care of, because my professional responsibilities were priority at that time. We had a lot to get done. We had people that were out of homes, and we ended up with no flush zones. We had no sewage relief. We had all types of issues we had to deal with. So I remember looking back at my time, because I had to submit it in for FEMA reimbursements, and it was over 200 hours in the first 15 days. That's why I say some of this is still a bit of a blur.
Oh, good. How would you characterize your interactions with those big federal agencies that came in, like FEMA?
I think we worked well together. I think it was one of those times, like anything, your situational awareness that you incur when the event unfolds is so much more than relaying that to somebody later that gets there. So it took some time to brief them up to speed. But once that got going, it was very well working together.
That's great.
Good support.
How would you characterize the general community's reaction to the event overall?
Well, it's not done. We're still in work progress. I mean, you just drive by any one of the bridges on Fish Creek that haven't been repaired yet, and you can still feel that anguish that those folks are going through. And I understand that we're finally getting some good decision makers to get some financing to get those things finished, because that's frustrating for me that I like to see things get fixed, and I like to get them done. We got a lot repaired. We got a lot back in order pretty quickly, but this outlying pieces like this are still just need to be done.
What are some sources of funding? You just mentioned that briefly, that the town utilized and you facilitated to make road repairs or working with nonprofits?
Well, in the initial response, I mean, we're using a lot of our general funds for sure for those types of things. But then FEMA, once this disaster declaration is declared by the president, then you're eligible for some FEMA funds. And we've been working through those for reimbursement. And we got a considerable amount to help out with our repairs. I know that the Fish Creek areas are multi-jurisdictional. So you've got county, and you've got town, and you've got National Highway Transportation and Safety. So those entities are working together to establish the funding process for those repairs.
Great. With such a large-scale event, it doesn't seem possible to get back to normal as it was before. How would you describe post-flood normal?
The term kind of came up as new normal, and I think people are using that. This is our new normal. It's anywhere you drive, you can still see remnants, and like I said, we just talked about the Fish Creek damage areas, but even ecologically, I mean, you look at the rivers and you look at trees that are down and erosion that we've experienced, and the big slide out on Highway 7 that you never would have expected would have occurred, that just about mowed over that Aspen Lodge, I believe it was. I mean, we're adjusting. And I'm sure kids that'll come along will never have an idea, but the ones that grew up and remember the 6 and 7 cabins that used to be on the corner on a mile marker, for instance, you just go by there and you think back that how devastating this truly was, and we handled it, and fortunately we had everybody come together, and our community came together, and just greatness, I would say, to be able to manage this, because we were on our own for quite some time, and still were able to take care of everything. We didn't have any deaths, very reported few injuries. So I think it was a success.
How long did it take you before you felt like you got to that point of new normal?
I'm still going through it now. But the adjustment portion, a couple of years, I'd say. And I think once we get some of the infrastructure back where it was, or at least replaced, I think then both folks will just have remnants of memory, but it just depends on where you were and what you were doing at the time. Like anything else, when major events happen, you can remember places and time. But it's a couple of years easy. I'm sure other folks are probably even longer.
Can you talk about some of the short and long-term impacts the flood had on the community?
We kind of went over those, but obviously the first portion of it was just, safety management. I remember looking across the street at Elkhorn, and I've never seen water all the way across Elkhorn at the intersection of 34, 36, and that was astounding to me. So the short term of it was just amazement that this water truly could overwhelm us this much. Long term, well, I can tell you it's strengthened this community. Lots of folks are stronger and have learned a lot and have learned how to work well together. Volunteers are vital, and I think we've learned how better to work with each other towards managing something of this kind of an event. Tensions still rise when runoff comes around. all of us are a little bit more, I'd say a lot more, especially in my field, watching the graphs and the predictions and stare at those thunderstorms a little more intently than we used to. So in long term, I think we're more aware.
You talked on 'em a little bit briefly, but what were some of the lessons you learned from the event in terms of flood mitigation, response, recovery, preparedness?
Every one of those terms carry a lot of weight. I learned that in the response mode, you need to be thinking of recovery right away, where lots of folks would get into the response and not consider what's coming. For instance, when we were putting together temporary bridges, one of the main focuses that I put out for our tasks of those days were, let's build this bridge where we're going to be putting the permanent bridge, because we don't want to build it twice. So you try to think ahead in those areas. Let's, place the dirt on that we're going to use for managing, let's say, a damaged area of Fish Creek, so that it can be used, in the long term for full permanent repair, and not just throw things into places that we think are just helpful at the time. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you need to be thinking about recovery immediately. And we do that, and we were doing that, but we're getting better at that, because such an event like that is gonna, you get some things that take you by surprise a bit, but we prepared. I think one of the things I look back on that truly helped this entire incident is when I came back from that FEMA course in Maryland. One of the suggestions was to make sure all of your employees in your organization that work for a municipality are trained in response in ICS, Incident Command System. So it took it upon, as the emergency manager, took it upon myself to make sure at least every one of our employees had some introduction to some higher levels, depending on what their role was in the town, to make sure they were trained. And I think that a little bit of training, honestly, just helped immensely when it came to organizational awareness, organizational resource management, and personnel and equipment and those types of things.
Thank you. What were some of your post-flood cleanup duties?
Mine was mainly gathering all the information that we'd acquired in data form to make sure it was presented well, so FEMA could then review all of our documentation. I didn't actually have any field duties at that time, except to make sure we were supplying personnel that we had to the right locations, so we were getting the most efficient, effective work possible. One of the things we did with the police department is we had some citizens that actually volunteered their residences. They were summer residences. They were not in town, and they were empty or vacant, and they volunteered a couple of residences so we could actually bring the police department. We had to bring them around through Blackhawk at that time, I-70. It was a long drive, but we let them live in town, and we worked 12-hour shifts with them for 5 days in a row, and then we'd switch them so they can then, because some of our police officers live out, and some employees as well, live out in the valley outside of Estes. So once we got open access, we let them live here, and was fortunate to have that opportunity.
Absolutely. What are some things the town has done since the flood in terms of mitigation and preventing future floods?
Working, I know Mr. Lancaster has done a lot of work with the municipalities around in planning, and our training is immense now. We've hyped up our training a bit for emergency management. I was on the board just this last year, and we're putting together an all hazards mitigation plan for the countywide. They had one, but we're revising it this year to make sure that we're up to speed and everything's on the current, particularly for not just response, but for resource management, so how we can share resources better. One of the problems, obviously, was we had no transportation roads to get people up in and out for resources. But once we opened the roads during the flood, we had trucks from Lafayette We had trucks from Fort Collins, light and power trucks that were helping out. So those shared resources, we're going to have a better roadmap for those in the future after this mitigation plan gets completed this year in September.
Fantastic.
And besides, we did a lot more training with the employees, lots of tabletops, debriefings on where and what they went through, how they could better perform the duties of the floods. We had multiple debriefings.
Great. Within that hazard mitigation plan, were there any unforeseen hazards that you encountered during the flood?
Yeah, I would say so, yes. One would be the sewage release on Fish Creek. It devastated those lines. So, and we have, as you go farther out of town, there's sewage systems that aren't online. They're septic tank systems and things like that. So we obviously had a lot of materials coming down Fish Creek of sewage capacity that we weren't even, it probably never was considered. I know that Upper Thompson was mentioning that they'd never seen anything this devastating. And then BOR has to deal, and to this day you can drive by and see all the sand that was deposited in those areas that needs to eventually be removed, because they're probably down some contaminants down pretty deep. But things have a way of washing themselves through and out, which is a filtering process, obviously. But yeah, those are some areas that we just didn't, it was unanticipated.
Awesome.
The Fish Creek reached a level that we've never seen before.
Is there any other specific incidents during the floods that occurred that you'd like to share?
It's just, we have some resilient people. I know I'm thinking about when we were told that the YMCA bridge had failed, and all those folks at the Y were stuck in, for quite some time. And I called out there a few times just to check and see if everything was okay, and in the background you could hear them singing and playing guitar. So they were taking care of themselves pretty well.
Awesome. And this is just a question I like to ask everyone I interview. Is there a particular memory that stands out during the event, maybe more so than others?
That when that lady asked me, and I made mention to that catchphrase that we had, and told her that we were going to take care of things, and just the comfort level, or the comfort that it gave her, was very warming and very satisfying. It was, I don't know how to explain this. It's an emotional feeling, I guess. But that point on, it was like, she came in for that reason, and she kind of gave us that spark of, we know why we're doing this, but now we got a face, and now we got more faces, and every time we faced those faces, we got to encourage folks. I think that was the memory of just knowing that we're prepared, we're going to handle this, we're going to take care of this. There's lots of inconvenience, but we're all still alive and we're still here. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And then is there anything that we've talked about that you'd like to go back to and clarify or add any new information about?
I'd like to get a few of those memories back if you could help.
Yeah.
Because like I said, there was the first couple 3 days, I know I was in professional emergency management mode, but I look back and everybody that I've talked to says we all, everything was working, clicking real well. But no, I think we've covered it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure.